They spent their lives filling the king's vault, happily playing the villains to squeeze every penny from the rich, only to be thanked with an executioner's axe while the crowd cheered. Empson and Dudley are the ultimate example of a brutal truth. Sometimes doing your job too well is a death sentence. Their heads didn't roll because they failed, but because their deaths were the perfect gift for a new king desperate to buy the public's love. These men weren't soldiers on a battlefield. They were desk assassins who used old law books as weapons to hunt down anyone with money. Under Henry VII, just the whisper of their names made powerful nobles and wealthy merchants sweat, knowing their fortunes were about to vanish. They turned the legal system into a ruthless trap, proving that a sharp pen can be far more terrifying and destructive than any sword. The story begins in August 1485 on the bloody fields of Bosworth, where the death of Richard III marked the rise of Henry Tudor. Although Henry VII claimed the crown by right of conquest, he was a paranoid exile ruling a fractured nation. He understood a terrifying truth. The violence that placed him on the throne could just as easily be used to remove him. England was exhausted by the Wars of the Roses, a time when powerful nobles acted like warlords, and kings were easily overthrown. Henry faced an empty treasury, a broken administration, and ambitious barons waiting for him to fail. Without a standing army or the money to hire mercenaries, his hold on power was incredibly fragile. To secure his dynasty, Henry realized he could not fight with swords. Instead, he chose to wage a war using paper, ink, and the law. He needed to break the power of the nobility and fill the royal coffers through aggressive legal maneuvering. This required a new type of government, one that bypassed the slow ancient systems of the past. Henry distrusted the old aristocracy, preferring new men, ambitious, low-born lawyers who owed their entire existence to him. He sought ruthless agents capable of exploiting every legal loophole to extract wealth and enforce his will. In the dusty corners of the legal world, he found his perfect weapons, Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley. The first of these instruments of royal will was Richard Empson. To the haughty nobility of the English court, Empson was a walking insult. He was born around 1450 in Towcester, Northamptonshire. The aristocracy loved to whisper behind their hands that Empson was the son of a sieve maker, a basket weaver. It was a slur designed to highlight his lack of breeding, to paint him as a peasant grasping at the hem of power. The truth was slightly more respectable, though hardly illustrious. His father, Peter Empson, was a man of some local standing, a bailiff and a property owner, but certainly not a gentleman of coat armor. Richard Empson grew up far from the silken corridors of power. He grew up in the world of provincial commerce and local disputes. He learned early on that the law was not a distinct abstract concept of justice. It was a cudgel used by the strong to beat the weak, or by the clever to outwit the strong. Empson was not blessed with the easy charm of the courtier. Accounts of him suggest a man who was abrasive, direct, and possessed of a biting, sarcastic wit. He carried the classic chip on the shoulder of the self-made man. He knew the nobles despised him for his birth, and he returned the favor by despising them for their stupidity. He saw them as dinosaur relics, men who knew how to joust but couldn't read a balance sheet. He trained as a lawyer, likely at an inn of court, though the records are sparse. What is known is that he possessed a mind like a steel trap. He specialized in the gritty, unglamorous side of the law, property rights, feudal dues, and the complex web of obligations that bound the English tenantry to their lords. His rise was slow and steady, a testament to his grinding work ethic. He worked as an administrator for the Duchy of Lancaster, a massive royal estate. Here, Empson found his calling. The duchy was a microcosm of the kingdom, vast, unruly, and inefficient. Tenants were hiding income, local lords were encroaching on royal land. Empson went through the records with a fine-toothed comb. He litigated, he threatened, and he collected. He proved to anyone watching that he could squeeze water from a stone. By 1491, his competence had earned him a seat in Parliament as the representative for Northamptonshire. It was here that he began to catch the king's eye. Henry VII was looking for men who were learned in the law, but also ruthless in its application. He saw in Empson a mirror of his own fiscal obsession. Empson was eventually knighted, a title that sat uncomfortably on him in the eyes of the old peers. But Sir Richard didn't care for their approval. He cared for power. He became the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster in 1504. This was a position of immense influence, placing him in charge of the king's private estates. But Empson was not content with merely managing estates. He saw the potential for something grander. He looked at the laws of England, the ancient dusty statutes regarding treason, retaining and feudal obligations, and he didn't see a system of justice. He saw a gold mine. He realized that almost everyone in England, from the highest duke to the lowest merchant, was technically guilty of something. The laws were so complex, so contradictory, and so old that no man could walk a straight line without tripping. All one needed was the will to prosecute. Empson brought a thug-like intensity to the king's council. He was the bad cop, the enforcer. If a nobleman refused to pay a fine, Empson was the one who would stare him down, detailing exactly how the king would strip him of his titles, his lands, and perhaps his freedom, all while citing the specific subsection of a statute written 200 years prior. He was the hammer. But for the system to work perfectly, Henry VII needed an anvil. He needed someone with a veneer of respectability, someone who could dress up this extortion in the flowery language of high jurisprudence. Enter Edmund Dudley. If Empson was the rough-hewn product of the provinces, Edmund Dudley was the polished gem of the establishment. Born around 1462, he was a generation younger than Empson. He was the grandson of John Sutton, the first Baron Dudley. He had blue blood in his veins, though he was a younger son of a younger son, meaning he had to work for his living. Dudley was educated at Oxford University and then Gray's Inn, one of the prestigious legal societies of London. He was brilliant. There is no other word for it. His mind was an encyclopedia of legal precedent. He was articulate, charismatic, and possessed a terrifyingly precise memory. Thomas More, the future saint and Lord Chancellor, knew Dudley well. They moved in the same circles. More described Dudley as a man of wit and learning, but noted a dark cloud that hung over his ambition. Dudley had the ability to make the horrific sound reasonable. He could look a man in the eye, smile politely, and explain why it was legally necessary for that man to hand over his entire fortune to the king. Dudley's rise was meteoric. His connections and his talent fast-tracked him to the center of power. Like Empson, he served as Speaker of the House of Commons in 1504, a role that, in Tudor times, was less about representing the people and more about managing the king's business in Parliament. Dudley's specialty was the prerogative. This was the area of law that dealt with the king's absolute rights, rights that superseded the common law. He studied the ancient feudal relationships, where the king was not just a ruler, but the supreme landlord of all England. He realized that over the centuries, the nobility had allowed these obligations to slide. They had treated royal rights as mere formalities, often ignoring fees for inheritance, marriage, or wardship. In Dudley's eyes, The nobility of England were not just proud peers, they were debtors, and the debt was past due. While Empson was the bludgeon, Dudley was the scalpel. He was the president of the King's Council, the first layman to hold the post. He organized the paperwork. He created the ledgers. He systematized the extortion. It is interesting to note that despite their partnership, Empson and Dudley were not friends. They were colleagues in a high-stakes enterprise. They likely viewed each other with a mixture of respect and wariness. Empson probably saw Dudley as a soft-handed fancy boy. Dudley likely viewed Empson as a crude provincial, but their skills were perfectly complementary. Together they formed the nexus of Henry VII's later reign. They were the architects of a system designed to bypass the traditional courts. The common law courts, the Court of King's Bench or Common Pleas, were too slow. They relied on juries, and juries could be bribed or intimidated by powerful local lords. If the king wanted to sue a duke in his own county, the local jury would never convict him. Henry VII needed a court where juries didn't exist, a court where the king's word was final. The vehicle for their tyranny was innocuous in name but terrifying in practice. The council learned in the law. Originally, this was just a subcommittee of the king's main council, designed to handle debt collection and administrative issues for the Duchy of Lancaster. But under the guidance of Empson and Dudley, and with the full blessing of Henry VII, it metastasized into a star chamber of fiscal terror. The council met in the Duchy Chamber at the Palace of Westminster, or sometimes at Empson's private house near St. Swithin's Church, known ominously as the Parsonage. Imagine the scene. A wealthy merchant or a minor baron receives a summons. It is a small strip of parchment sealed with the Privy Seal. It does not specify the charge. It simply commands attendance before the council learned. The victim arrives. The room is small, intimate, and suffocating. There is no gallery of peers. There is no jury of 12 good men and true. There is only a table. Behind it sits Sir Richard Empson, with his hard, unblinking stare, and Edmund Dudley arranging his papers with fastidious care. The proceedings were a mockery of justice. The defendant was often not allowed legal counsel. After all, this wasn't technically a court of law. It was an administrative hearing. Therefore, the rights of the subject did not apply. Dudley would open the ledger. He would speak softly, citing a statute from the reign of Edward I or Henry III, laws that had been dormant for 200 years. "It appears, my lord," Dudley might say, "that in the 3rd year of your tenure you took possession of your wife's estate without the proper license of the king. This is a violation of the prerogative." The victim would protest, "But no one has applied for that license in 50 years. It is a dead law." Then Empson would lean forward. "The law does not die, sir. It merely sleeps. And now it is awake." The verdict was predetermined. The goal was not justice. The goal was the settlement. And this brings us to the most insidious weapon in their arsenal, a weapon that destroyed peace of mind as effectively as it destroyed bank accounts: the bond. The genius of Empson and Dudley lay in their understanding of psychology. They knew that taking a man's money was good, but owning a man's future was better. They utilized bonds and recognizances on an industrial scale. A recognizance was a formal acknowledgement of a debt or an obligation, recorded before a court. A bond was the financial penalty attached to it. Here is how it worked. The council learned would accuse a nobleman of a transgression, perhaps a riot caused by his servants, or a failure to attend a royal summons. Instead of fining him £100 and letting him go, they would force him to sign a bond for £5,000. But there was a twist. The nobleman didn't have to pay the £5,000 immediately. The payment was suspended on the condition of his good behavior. Good behavior was deliberately vague. It meant whatever the king wanted it to mean. It meant voting the right way in Parliament. It meant staying on your estate and not raising troops. It meant providing gifts to the king at Christmas. If the nobleman stepped out of line even by an inch, Empson and Dudley would activate the bond. The £5,000 would be due immediately. Ruin would be instantaneous. This created a nation of terrified conformists. Over half of the peerage of England was under some form of financial bond to Henry VII by the end of his reign. The Marquis of Dorset was under a bond of £10,000. The Earl of Northumberland, one of the most powerful men in the north, was bound for massive sums. They were not just subjects anymore, they were hostages. Henry VII reviewed these accounts personally. There are surviving documents where the king has initialed the bonds himself. In one famous margin note concerning a man who had been fined for a minor infraction, Henry wrote, "For this he must pay, or else." The "or else" was the silence of the tower. As the years of Henry VII's reign ticked down, the greed became frantic. The king's health was failing. He became more reclusive, more suspicious. He saw treason in every shadow. Empson and Dudley fed this paranoia. They employed a vast network of promoters, spies and informers who roamed the counties of England. These promoters were despised more than the plague. They would spy on a wedding to see if the dress code violated sumptuary laws. They would count the number of retainers a knight rode with. They would check if a merchant was exporting wool with the correct stamp. Every minor infraction was reported back to the parsonage, where Dudley would calculate the fine and Empson would sign the summons. By 1508, the atmosphere in England was toxic. The king was rich, fabulously, unimaginably rich. The crown was solvent for the first time in centuries. But the cost was the total alienation of the ruling class. The nobility sat in their drafty halls, staring at the bonds they had signed, drinking wine they could barely afford, and whispering. They whispered about the caterpillars of the Commonwealth. They whispered about the two lawyers who sat at the king's right hand like twin gargoyles. They waited for the king to die. But Empson and Dudley, blinded by their own success and the insulation of the king's favor, failed to see the cliff edge approaching. They believed they were indispensable. They believed the law would protect them because they were the law. They were wrong. As the coffers filled and the nobility seethed, the two architects of this financial fortress believed themselves untouchable. They had forgotten that their authority was entirely borrowed, tethered to the life of a single sickly man. When the king's health began to falter, the protective wall around them started to crumble, exposing them to a nation hungry for revenge. The silence of the sick room was about to give way to the roar of the mob, and the transition of power would demand a sacrifice that no amount of gold could buy. April 1509. The corridors of Richmond Palace were hushed, the air thick with the smell of incense and sickness. In the royal bedchamber, the breathing of Henry VII had become a ragged rattle. The man who had silenced the nobility of England, who had turned the terrifying machinery of the state into a personal accounting firm, was finally losing his battle with tuberculosis. For Empson and Dudley, the impending death of the king was not a tragedy. It was a catastrophe. They were intelligent men. They knew their power was not intrinsic. It was reflected. They shone only because they stood in the light of the king's favor. Without him, they were just two hated lawyers surrounded by enemies they had systematically impoverished. On April 21st, 1509, the king's breath stopped. The reign of the first Tudor monarch was over. What happened next was a masterclass in political maneuvering, orchestrated by the few men who held power alongside Empson and Dudley, men like Bishop Richard Fox and Thomas Lovell. These men were survivors. They knew that the transition of power is the most dangerous moment for any monarchy. For 2 days, the king's death was kept a profound secret. The palace gates remained shut. Meals were still taken into the royal chamber. The court went through the motions of the day, a pantomime performed for an audience of none. Fox and Lovell needed time to secure the treasury, to secure the loyalty of the guard, and most importantly, to secure the person of the new king, Henry VIII. During these 48 hours of silence, Empson and Dudley must have felt the temperature drop. They were excluded from the inner circle of the transition team. The Fox, Bishop Fox, was distancing himself from the leeches. The political calculus was being rewritten in real time. The old king's debts were about to be canceled, and Empson and Dudley were the currency with which the new regime would pay for its popularity. When the announcement was finally made on April 23rd, St. George's Day, a fittingly patriotic date, the reaction of the public was not mourning. It was a collective exhale of relief. The miser was dead. The dragon was gone. And all eyes turned to the new sun rising in the east, a 17-year-old boy with red gold hair and a smile that promised a new golden age. It is impossible to overstate the difference between father and son. Henry VII was dark, suspicious, slight of build, and famously frugal. He ruled from the shadows, a spider in a web of dossiers. Henry VIII was a god of spring. Standing over 6 feet tall with a powerful athlete's build, he was the physical embodiment of knightly virtue. He loved hunting, jousting, dancing, and music. He was educated, charming, and desperate to be loved. This desire for love was the key to Empson and Dudley's doom. Henry VII didn't care if his subjects loved him, as long as they obeyed him. Henry VIII wanted the adoration of the crowd. He wanted to ride through London and hear the cheers ring off the gables. But the young king faced a dilemma. The royal treasury was overflowing with wealth that would fund his magnificent pageants and wars. But that wealth was tainted. It was blood money, extracted through the tyranny of his father's agents. The people were angry. The nobility was seething. There were whispers of revolt in the shires. Henry VIII needed to signal a break with the past. He needed to show that his reign would be one of justice, mercy, and chivalry. But he couldn't very well admit that his father was a tyrant. That would delegitimize his own succession. He couldn't say, "My father stole this money." Instead, he adopted the oldest political strategy in history, blaming the subordinates. The narrative was quickly constructed. King Henry VII was a good and noble monarch, but he had been deceived. He had been misled by wicked, grasping counselors who had abused his trust and twisted the law for their own evil ends. The king remained the sun. The clouds were merely Empson and Dudley. On the very first day of his reign, Henry VIII issued a proclamation. He promised to redress the wrongs of the past. He promised to review the bonds and recognizances. It was a masterstroke of PR. The young king was the hero, riding to the rescue of his oppressed people. But a hero needs a dragon to slay. The speed of the collapse was terrifying. Empson and Dudley were not given weeks to pack their bags or flee to the continent. The new regime struck while the iron was hot. On April 24th, just 1 day after the public announcement of the old king's death, the blow fell. Richard Empson was attending a meeting of the council in Northamptonshire when the warrant arrived. He was dragged from the chamber, his protests ignored. The man who had issued thousands of summonses was now on the receiving end of the ultimate summons. Edmund Dudley was taken in London. He was seized by the king's guard, stripped of his chains of office, and marched through the streets. The news of their arrest spread through London like wildfire. The reaction was visceral. These were not just unpopular politicians. They were the faces of ruin for thousands of families. Mobs descended on their properties. Empson's house near St. Swithin's, the dreaded parsonage where he had ruined so many lives, was ransacked. Windows were smashed, tapestries torn down, and furniture dragged into the street. Dudley's home suffered a similar fate. The people were looking for the ledgers. They wanted to burn the books that held their debts. They wanted to erase the ink that had enslaved them. The two men were thrown into the Tower of London. The irony was heavy. This was the fortress where they had sent so many others. Now, the damp stone walls of the Bell Tower and the Beauchamp Tower were their only companions. But the crown faced a significant legal hurdle. Henry VIII wanted them dead, but he wanted them dead legally. He wanted a trial, a verdict, and an execution. He wanted the veneer of justice. The problem was Empson and Dudley hadn't actually broken the law. Every fine they levied, every bond they enforced, every estate they seized, it was all done according to the statutes of the realm. Cruel? Yes. Unfair? Absolutely. But illegal? No. Furthermore, they had the ultimate defense, Rex Volt. The king wills it. They had acted under the direct written authority of Henry VII. If Empson and Dudley were put on trial for extortion, their defense would be simple. Here is the warrant, signed by the king's own hand. To convict them of extortion would be to put the dead king on trial. It would reveal the Tudor monarchy as a kleptocracy. It would effectively tell the world that the inheritance Henry VIII was now spending was stolen property. The crown lawyers, men who had once worked alongside Empson and Dudley, scratched their heads. How do you execute men for obeying orders? They decided to invent a crime. The legal charge cooked up against Empson and Dudley is one of the most audacious fabrications in English legal history. It was a concept known as constructive treason. Since the lawyers couldn't get them on financial crimes without implicating the old king, they accused them of plotting to kill the new one. The indictment claimed that during the final illness of Henry VII, Empson and Dudley had engaged in a conspiracy. It alleged that they had written letters to their friends and retainers, summoning armed men to London. The prosecution argued that this gathering of arms was not for the protection of the realm, but for a coup d'etat. The narrative spun by the crown was that Empson and Dudley intended to seize, guide, and rule the young king, or if he proved difficult, to destroy him and place someone else on the throne. It was, of course, complete nonsense. Historians agree that Empson and Dudley almost certainly did summon armed men, but they did so because that was standard procedure when a king died. The transition of power was a dangerous time. Riots were common. Ministers of the crown were expected to have muscle on hand to keep the peace. Their actions were those of loyal servants trying to prevent anarchy, not traitors trying to cause it. But the truth was irrelevant. The verdict was a political necessity. The trials were held separately, presumably to prevent the two men from mounting a coordinated defense. Edmund Dudley was tried first on July 18, 1509, at the Guildhall in London. The jury was handpicked. The outcome was never in doubt. Dudley, the man of fine words, found that his eloquence fell on deaf ears. He argued that he had only ever served the king's interests. He pointed out the absurdity of the treason charge. But the jury, terrified of the new king's wrath and perhaps eager for revenge themselves, returned a verdict of guilty in minutes. Sir Richard Empson was a harder nut to crack. The crown decided to humiliate him by trying him in Northampton, his home county, the place where he had once been the undisputed master. In October 1509, Empson was hauled before the court at Northampton Castle. The scene was dramatic. The courtroom was packed with the local gentry, men Empson had fined, bullied and belittled for years. They were there to watch the bulldog get put down. But Empson did not go quietly. In a speech recorded by later chroniclers, he tore the prosecution's case to shreds. He spoke with the furious logic of a lawyer who knows he is being framed. If, he thundered, we are to be punished for obeying the king's commands, then no man is safe. For the king's command is the law. If I am a traitor for collecting the king's debts, then the king himself was a thief for demanding them. It was a brilliant, cutting defense. It exposed the hypocrisy of the entire charade. But it didn't matter. The jury in Northampton hated him. They would have convicted him of witchcraft if asked. He too was found guilty of treason. Both men were attainted. An act of attainder was a legislative death sentence. It stripped them of their titles, their lands, and their goods. It declared their blood corrupt, meaning their children could inherit nothing. They were erased from the social fabric of England. And then the axe hovered. For reasons that remain debated by historians, Henry VIII did not sign the death warrants immediately. Weeks turned into months. Autumn turned to winter. The year 1509 ended, and 1510 began. Empson and Dudley remained in the Tower. Why the delay? Some suggest the young king had a crisis of conscience. Despite his desire for popularity, he knew these men were innocent of treason. He knew they were being murdered for his father's sins. Perhaps the Golden Prince wasn't quite ready to have that much blood on his hands. Others suggest it was a pragmatic delay. Henry VIII wanted to squeeze them for information. Where was the rest of the money? Where were the deeds? Empson and Dudley were the only ones who understood the labyrinthine filing system of the council learned. Killing them too soon might mean losing track of millions in potential revenue. During this long, dark twilight in the Tower, Edmund Dudley did something extraordinary. Faced with the wreckage of his life awaiting a traitor's death, he turned to his pen. He wrote a treatise entitled The Tree of Commonwealth. It is a surreal document. It is a guide to good government. In it, Dudley lectures the young king on the importance of justice, the dangers of bad counselors, irony noted, and the need for the monarch to protect the poor from the predation of the rich. He writes of the root of the administration of justice and the fruit of good government. He urges the king to avoid unreasonable desires and to live within his means. Was this genuine repentance? Was Dudley looking back at his life and realizing the horror of what he had become? Or was it a cynical attempt to flatter the intellectual vanity of the young Henry VIII, hoping the book would earn him a pardon? The book was never delivered to the king. It disappeared into the archives, a forgotten testament to the complexity of a man who could write like a saint while acting like a sinner. By the summer of 1510, the initial euphoria of Henry VIII's accession was wearing off. The parties were still grand, the jousts still spectacular, but the reality of governance was setting in. The king went on a royal progress, a tour of the countryside. He expected adulation. Instead, he heard grumbling. The people were asking questions. We thought the tyranny was over, they said, but the taxes are still high. The bonds are still being collected. Henry VIII, despite his rhetoric, had quietly kept many of his father's financial mechanisms in place. And then, the inevitable question, why are the villains still alive? Rumors began to circulate that the king intended to pardon them. The gentry were horrified. If Empson and Dudley were released, they might return to power. They might seek revenge. The fear of the return of the monster gripped the court. Henry VIII realized he had a choice. He could save his conscience, or he could save his popularity. He could be the just man who spared the innocent, or he could be the strong king who gave the people the blood they craved. Henry VIII was a Tudor. He chose power. He signed the warrants. August 17th, 1510. The day was likely warm, the sun beating down on the cobbles of London. The gates of the Tower opened. A procession emerged. It was not the grand procession of a coronation, but the somber march of death. Empson and Dudley were led out. They had been in prison for 16 months. They were pale, likely gaunt from the poor diet of the Tower. They were stripped of their finery. No longer the Chancellor of the Duchy or the President of the Council. They were just two middle-aged men in simple tunics. The crowd on Tower Hill was immense. This was the main event. The spectators jeered and threw filth. They screamed the names of the family members Empson and Dudley had imprisoned, the fortunes they had stolen. The scaffold loomed high above the heads of the mob, draped in black. The block was waiting. Sir Richard Empson went first. The sieve maker's son, the bulldog, the man who had clawed his way up from nothing, looked out at the sea of hatred. He offered no apology. He knelt, placed his head on the wood, and the axe severed the connection between his brilliant, ruthless brain and his body. Edmund Dudley followed. The intellectual, the writer, the aristocrat. He knelt in the blood of his partner. He prayed, perhaps thinking of his tree of commonwealth, perhaps thinking of his wife and children. The axe fell again. The heads were lifted. The crowd roared. The debt was paid. The bodies of Empson and Dudley were buried. Empson in the White Friars Church, Dudley in Blackfriars. They were meant to be forgotten. Cautionary tales of greed and overreach. When the axe fell on Tower Hill in August 1510, it did not just sever the head of Edmund Dudley, it severed the lifeline of his entire family. In the ruthless calculus of Tudor justice, the punishment of a traitor was designed to be total. It was not enough to kill the man. One had to kill his legacy. Edmund Dudley left behind a widow, Elizabeth Grey, and a young family. Among them was his eldest son, John Dudley, a boy of barely 6 years old. The position of Elizabeth Grey was precarious, yet she possessed a weapon her husband had lacked: high aristocratic connections. She was the daughter of Edward Grey, Viscount Lisle, a man of ancient lineage. While Edmund Dudley had been the new man, the upstart lawyer, his wife was of the old blood. In the immediate aftermath of the execution, the crown seized everything. The vast estates Edmund had accumulated, the manor houses, the hoards of plate and coin, all were forfeit to the king. The Dudley family was effectively destitute, stripping the young John Dudley of his inheritance, his title, and his future. He was the son of a corrupt man, a pariah in the court of the young golden Henry VIII. But the Tudor court was a place of shifting alliances. The anger of the king was performative. Once the villain was dead, the utility of punishing the widow and child diminished. Furthermore, Elizabeth Grey was a woman of resilience. She did not fade into a convent. Instead, she married again, almost immediately, to Arthur Plantagenet, the illegitimate son of King Edward IV. This marriage was a masterstroke of survival. By marrying the king's uncle, albeit an illegitimate one, she brought the tainted Dudley children back into the orbit of the royal family. It was the first step on a long, treacherous road to redemption. For the young John Dudley, growing up in the shadow of his father's scaffold, must have been a defining psychological burden. He lived with the stain of treason on his name. He saw how easily fortunes could be made and lost. He learned, perhaps even earlier than his father, that in England safety did not come from law books. It came from being useful to the king. If Edmund Dudley had tried to conquer England with a quill, his son John decided to conquer it with a sword. John Dudley realized that he could never be a lawyer. The memory of his father's counsel learned was too toxic. To restore his family's honor, he had to embrace the persona that Henry VIII admired most, the warrior courtier. In 1512, Parliament began the slow process of reversing the attainder. It was not a full forgiveness. The crown kept much of the money, but it allowed John Dudley to inherit some land, and crucially to exist legally as a person again. By 1523, the 19-year-old John was ready to prove himself. He accompanied the Duke of Suffolk on a campaign to France. This was the theater of Henry VIII's dreams, the glorious replay of Agincourt. John Dudley did not disappoint. He fought with a reckless bravery that suggested a man with nothing to lose. He was knighted on the battlefield by the Duke of Suffolk for gallantry at the crossing of the Somme. Consider the symbolism. The son of the despised bureaucrat, the man whose father was synonymous with greed and cowardice, was now a knight of the realm, anointed in the blood of the French. He had washed away the sins of the father with the service of the son. Back at court, Sir John Dudley proved to be everything his father was not. He was athletic, handsome, and adept at the martial sports Henry VIII loved. He became a favorite in the tilting yard. He understood that to survive under Henry VIII, one had to be a mirror, reflecting the king's own self-image of chivalric grandeur back at him. But beneath the armor, John had inherited Edmund's brain. He was not just a brute, he was calculating. He attached himself to the rising stars of the court, first Wolsey, then Cromwell, navigating the brutal factionalism with a silent, shark-like grace. As Henry VIII aged, the Golden Prince turned into the bloated, tyrannical monster of legend. The court became a slaughterhouse. Queens were beheaded, ministers were executed, and the Reformation tore the country apart. Through it all, John Dudley rose. He avoided the trap of religious fanaticism. He was a pragmatist. When the king broke with Rome, Dudley became a reformer. When the king swung back toward conservatism, Dudley kept his head down. His real talent lay in administration, a genetic gift, perhaps. In 1542, he was made Lord High Admiral. He took to the sea with the same vigor he had shown on land. He reorganized the navy, fought the French fleet in the Solent, and oversaw the defense of the realm during the invasion scares of the 1540s. By the end of Henry VIII's reign in 1547, John Dudley was no longer the traitor's son. He was the Viscount Lisle, a Knight of the Garter, and one of the 16 executors of the king's will. He had achieved the impossible. He had not only restored his house, he had built it higher than Edmund could have ever dreamed. But the death of Henry VIII left a vacuum even more dangerous than the one in 1509. The new king, Edward VI, was a boy of 9. England was about to be ruled by a child, which meant it would really be ruled by the wolves standing behind the throne. The first wolf to step forward was Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, the young king's uncle. Seymour seized power and named himself Lord Protector. John Dudley, now the Earl of Warwick, supported Seymour initially. They were allies in the Reformation and comrades in war, but Seymour was a disastrous ruler. He was arrogant, aloof, and obsessed with a costly war in Scotland. Moreover, his populist policies sparked rebellions across England in 1549, the Prayer Book Rebellion in the west, and Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk. Kett's Rebellion was the turning point. Thousands of angry peasants seized control of Norwich. The government was paralyzed. Somerset dithered, unable to crush the people he claimed to protect. John Dudley did not dither. He led an army to Norfolk. At the Battle of Dussindale, he crushed the rebels with ruthless efficiency, slaughtering over 3,000 of them. It was a massacre, but to the terrified nobility of London, it was salvation. Dudley returned to the capital not just as a hero, but as the only man capable of maintaining order. In October 1549, the knives came out. In a swift, bloodless coup, Dudley outmaneuvered Seymour. He didn't execute him immediately. He simply stripped him of power and had him thrown in the Tower. John Dudley was now the de facto ruler of England. He avoided the title Lord Protector, knowing it was tainted. Instead, he styled himself as the Lord President of the Council. It was a callback to his father's title, but with infinitely more power. In 1551, he raised himself to the highest rank of the peerage. He became the Duke of Northumberland. The grandson of the sieve maker was now a duke. History has been unkind to John Dudley, often painting him as the wicked duke, a caricature of ambition. This is largely Tudor propaganda written by his enemies. In reality, Dudley was a remarkably effective ruler. He inherited a bankrupt state, shades of 1485, and a chaotic administration. He ended the ruinous wars with France and Scotland, realizing, like his father, that peace was more profitable than war. He reformed the coinage which had been debased by Henry VIII. He clamped down on corruption in the revenue courts. There is a profound irony here. John Dudley spent his time in power dismantling the very fiscal tyranny his father had helped create, while simultaneously enriching himself through the dissolution of church lands. He was a man of his time, corrupt by modern standards, but a stabilizing force in a chaotic era. Crucially, he won the love of the boy king, Edward VI. Edward was a serious, fanatically Protestant child. He adored Dudley. Unlike the cold, distant Somerset, Dudley treated the king as an adult. He involved him in council business, listened to his opinions, and indulged his religious zeal. By 1553, the partnership between the teenage king and the seasoned duke seemed unshakable. They were reshaping England into a radical Protestant state. But biology once again intervened. In the spring of 1553, Edward VI fell ill. He began to cough up blood and tissue. It was tuberculosis, the same disease that had killed his grandfather, Henry VII, and his half-brother, the Duke of Richmond. The doctors whispered that the king had months, perhaps weeks, to live. For John Dudley, this was the nightmare scenario. If Edward died, the crown would pass to his half-sister, Mary Tudor. Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. She was a devout, unyielding Catholic. She hated the Reformation, and more importantly, she hated John Dudley. She viewed Dudley as the arch-heretic, the man who had led her brother astray, the man who had persecuted her friends. If Mary took the throne, Dudley knew exactly what would happen. He would follow his father to Tower Hill. The cycle was closing. The axe was being sharpened again. Panic breeds desperate measures. John Dudley, facing annihilation, concocted one of the most audacious plots in English history. He and the dying king drafted a document known as the Device for the Succession. It was a legal pretzel, twisting the laws of inheritance until they snapped. The device declared that both Mary Tudor, Catholic, and Elizabeth Tudor, Protestant, were illegitimate. It bypassed them entirely. Instead, the crown was to settle on the family of the Duchess of Suffolk, specifically her eldest daughter, Lady Jane Grey. Jane Grey was the grandniece of Henry VIII. She was young, brilliant, and a devout Protestant. She was perfect. But Dudley needed to secure his own position. He couldn't just put Jane on the throne. He needed to be the power behind it. So, in May 1553, as the king lay dying, Dudley arranged a marriage. He married his fourth son, Guilford Dudley, to Lady Jane Grey. The ambition was naked and breathtaking. John Dudley wasn't just trying to save the Reformation. He was trying to put his own bloodline on the throne. He was attempting to make the Dudleys the new royal house of England. On July 6, 1553, King Edward VI died. The trap was sprung. On July 10th, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen of England. She was brought to the Tower of London, not as a prisoner, but as a monarch, to await her coronation. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, stood at her side. He had done it. He had outsmarted the law, the church, and the dynasty. But he had forgotten the people. Dudley had made the same mistake his father made. He assumed that power resided in documents, in the Privy Council and in the Tower. He forgot that the legitimacy of the crown lay in the hearts of the English people. The people of England did not know Jane Grey. They viewed her as a puppet of the hated Duke of Northumberland. Conversely, they knew Mary Tudor. They remembered her mother, the beloved Catherine of Aragon. They saw Mary as the rightful heir, the victim of a wicked conspiracy. Mary did not flee. She rode to East Anglia and raised her standard. And something incredible happened. The country rose for her. Protestants and Catholics alike flocked to Mary's banner, not because they loved her religion, but because they respected the law of succession. They hated the overreaching ambition of the Dudleys more than they feared a Catholic queen. Dudley rode out with an army to crush Mary, just as he had crushed Ket's rebels. But as he marched, his army melted away. His own soldiers deserted him. The council in London, sensing the wind change, betrayed him. They proclaimed Mary Queen on July 19th. Dudley was stranded in Cambridge. He saw the end coming. In a pathetic final gesture, he went to the marketplace, threw his cap in the air, and cheered for Queen Mary, tears streaming down his face. It didn't work. John Dudley was arrested and brought back to the Tower of London. He was lodged in the Beauchamp Tower, likely in the same cold rooms where his father had spent his final days 43 years earlier. The trial was a formality. He was charged with high treason. When asked how he could be a traitor for obeying the orders of King Edward VI, a direct echo of his father's defense regarding Henry VII, the court replied that the great seal of a usurper was no authority at all. On August 22, 1553, John Dudley was led out to Tower Hill. He knelt, said his prayers, and for the second time in half a century, a Dudley head rolled in the straw. The axe had seemingly destroyed the family tree once again, but inside the tower, one branch remained. The year is 1554. The Tower of London has vomited out its dead, John Dudley, Guilford Dudley, Lady Jane Grey, and now sits quiet, digesting the tragedy. Robert Dudley, the fifth son of the executed Duke, remains within its walls. He is 21 years old. He should be dead. By all rights, the son of the arch-traitor who tried to steal Mary Thirst's crown should have his head on a spike on London Bridge. But Robert possessed a charm that even his enemies found difficult to resist, and he had brothers who had died already. Perhaps Mary felt enough blood had been spilled. He was released in October 1554, but freedom was a cold comfort. The Dudley name was poison. Their vast estates, the castles, the titles, everything his father John had accumulated were gone. Robert was a commoner again, stripped of his knighthood, living on the charity of his friends. He was the grandson of the leech Edmund and the son of the traitor John. He was a walking ghost of failed ambition. During the gloomy, firelit reign of Bloody Mary, Robert Dudley stayed low. He fought in Philip II's army in France, trying to wash the stain of treason off with the sweat of military service, just as his father had done decades before. He was desperate to prove his loyalty, but while he marched in the mud of St. Quentin, his mind was likely elsewhere. He was thinking of a girl. He had known her since they were 8 years old. They had shared tutors. They had shared the terrifying experience of having their fathers, Henry VIII and John Dudley, destroy their families. They were both bright, intense, and watchful. Her name was Elizabeth. And as Queen Mary's health failed in 1558, the wheel of fortune began its great creaking turn once more. November 17th, 1558. Queen Mary, I dies. The bells of London do not toll in mourning. They ring in celebration. The dark days of burning heretics are over. The red rose of the Tudors has bloomed again. Elizabeth I ascends the throne. She is 25, razor sharp, and determined to rule not as a woman, but as a prince. Her very first act as queen, before she had even appointed a council, was to name her master of the horse. It was one of the most prestigious positions in the royal household, requiring the holder to be physically close to the monarch at all times during travel and state ceremonies. She chose Robert Dudley. The court gasped. The traitor's son, the man whose father had tried to prevent Elizabeth from ever becoming queen? It seemed like madness, but Elizabeth knew what the rest of the world did not. She knew Robert's heart. Overnight, the grandson of the sieve maker was catapulted to the pinnacle of the English court. The dynamic between them was electric. They were young, they were survivors, and they were inseparable. He was sweet Robin to her. She was his goddess. While the old counselors like William Cecil fretted about policy and budgets, Robert Dudley danced with the Queen. He rode with her. He whispered in her ear during boring diplomatic receptions. The old nobility, the Howards and the Talbots, watched with grinding teeth. They saw history repeating itself. They saw the ghost of Edmund Dudley rising from the grave. Once again, a Dudley was at the king's or queen's right hand. Once again, a new man was usurping their rightful place. They called him the Gypsy for his dark eyes and dark hair. They whispered that he was a sorcerer who had bewitched the queen. But Robert didn't care. He had the only thing that mattered, the queen's favor. But there was a problem, a complication that threatened to turn this fairy tale into a Gothic horror. Robert Dudley was married. Years earlier, in a match arranged by his father, he had married a quiet country girl named Amy Robsart. It was a marriage of convenience, not passion. As Robert rose to the dizzying heights of the court, Amy remained behind in the country. She was ill, suffering from a malady in her breast, likely cancer. She was an inconvenience to a man who was openly flirting with the Queen of England. The rumors in London were vicious. People said Robert was waiting for her to die. Some said he wasn't just waiting, he was planning. The Spanish ambassador de Quadra wrote gleefully to King Philip, reporting that they, Elizabeth and Robert, are thinking of destroying Lord Robert's wife. Then, on September the 8th, 1560, the unthinkable happened. Amy Robsart was found dead at her residence, Cumnor Place. She was found at the bottom of a short flight of stone stairs. Her neck was broken. The timing was catastrophic. Just days before, the Queen had told the Spanish ambassador that Amy was dead or nearly so. Now she was actually dead. The scandal was nuclear. The entirety of Europe assumed Robert Dudley had murdered his wife to marry the Queen. In Paris, Mary Queen of Scots laughed that the Queen of England was about to marry her horsekeeper, who had killed his wife to make room in his bed. Robert was devastated, not necessarily by grief, but by the destruction of his ambitions. He knew that if he married Elizabeth now, he would be branded a murderer. The crown would be tainted. The coroner's jury ruled it misfortune, an accidental fall. Yet the timing was suspicious. While modern historians suspect cancer may have caused her bones to crumble, to the whispering court of 1560, there was only one verdict. Robert Dudley had cleared the path to the Queen's bed with murder. The ghost of his grandfather Edmund haunted him. Edmund had used the law to destroy lives. Robert was accused of bypassing the law to take one. The label of villain was stitched back onto the Dudley coat of arms. The scandal of Cumnor Place meant that Robert Dudley could never be king consort. Elizabeth, pragmatic as ever, realized she could not marry him without risking her throne, but she would not let him go. For the next 30 years, Robert Dudley remained the center of her world. If he could not be her husband, he would be her premier subject. In 1564, she raised him to the peerage. She created him Earl of Leicester. The ceremony was intimate and telling. As she placed the coronet on his head, Elizabeth couldn't resist reaching out and tickling his neck. It was a gesture of shocking familiarity, a signal to the room that while he was now an earl, he was still her creature. Robert embraced his role with the same administrative genius his father and grandfather had possessed. He wasn't just a pretty face. He became a key statesman. He was a patron of the arts, a champion of the Puritan faction, ironically given his lifestyle, and a promoter of exploration. He was the counterweight to the cautious William Cecil. Cecil was the head of the government. Dudley was the heart. Cecil wanted peace. Dudley wanted war with Spain. Cecil wanted to save money. Dudley wanted to spend it on magnificence, and spend it he did. If Edmund Dudley's sin was hoarding gold, Robert Dudley's sin was displaying it. He refurbished Kenilworth Castle, transforming it from a medieval fortress into a Renaissance palace of glass and stone. It was a monument to his ego and his obsession with the Queen. In July 1575, he hosted Elizabeth at Kenilworth for a 19-day festival that is still legendary in English history. It was a final desperate bid for her hand, or at least a celebration of their enduring bond. It was an assault on the senses. There were fireworks, water pageants on a man-made lake, mechanical dolphins that swam with a rion on their backs, plays, hunts, and banquets where hundreds of oxen were consumed. He even stopped the town clock at the moment of her arrival to signify that time stood still when the Queen was present. The cost was astronomical, enough to bankrupt a small nation. It was the ultimate rejection of his grandfather's miserly legacy. Edmund had bled the nobility to fill the king's coffers. Robert bled himself to entertain the Queen. Elizabeth enjoyed the show. She ate the food, watched the plays, and accepted the adoration. But when the fireworks faded and the music stopped, her answer remained the same. No, she would die a virgin queen, and he would remain her favorite, but never her master. As they aged, the relationship matured. The sexual tension was replaced by a deep, bickering, marital-like companionship. They fought furiously and forgave quickly. In 1585, war finally came. The Spanish Armada was building. The Protestant cause in the Netherlands was collapsing. Elizabeth reluctantly sent Robert Dudley to command her forces in the Low Countries. It was his chance to finally be the warrior hero his father John had been. But Robert was old, fat, and red-faced now. He was not the jouster of 1559. His campaign was a muddle of confused orders and logistical failures. He quarreled with the Dutch, he quarreled with his officers, and he quarreled with the Queen via letter. He returned to England in 1586, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. But when the ultimate crisis came, the Spanish Armada of 1588, he was where he always was, at her side. He organized the land defenses at Tilbury. It was Robert Dudley who walked beside Elizabeth's white horse as she gave her famous speech. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. He was the lieutenant and captain general of the Queen's armies and companies. The grandson of the executed lawyer was now the protector of the realm. The Armada was defeated. The winds of God blew the Spanish ships onto the rocks of Ireland. England was saved. But the exertion broke Robert. He was suffering from stomach cancer or perhaps malaria. He requested leave to travel to Buxton for the healing waters. On his way there, he stopped at his house at Cornbury Park in Oxfordshire. He wrote one last letter to Elizabeth. He asked after her health, signing it, "From your quartermaster, Rob Dudley." He died on September 4th, 1588. When the news reached Elizabeth, the woman who had famously never shown weakness collapsed. She locked herself in her chamber for days. Eventually, Lord Burghley, William Cecil had to order the door broken down. She kept his final letter in a small treasure box by her bed. She wrote on it, in her own hand, his last letter. It was found there when she died 15 years later. The death of Robert Dudley marked the end of the dynasty's power. He died without a legitimate heir. His only legitimate son, the noble imp, had died as a child. The vast estates of Kenilworth and Warwick reverted to the crown or were scattered. The House of Dudley, which had blazed so brightly and so destructively across the Tudor century, was extinguished. But let us look at the ledger one last time. Edmund Dudley, the architect, the man of ink. He built the financial machinery of the Tudor state. He taught the kings of England that the law could be a weapon of absolute power. He died a traitor, hated by all, his blood corrupted. John Dudley, the usurper, the man of the sword. He took his father's machinery and used it to seize the state itself. He ruled as a king in all but name. He pushed the ambition too far, trying to steal the crown itself. He died a traitor, hated by half the realm, his blood corrupted again. Robert Dudley, the favorite, the man of the heart. He learned the lessons of the father and grandfather. He sought not to be the king, but to be the king's shadow. He achieved what they could not, survival and love. He died in his bed a celebrated earl, the companion of the greatest monarch in English history. It is a story of evolution. The raw, grasping greed of the grandfather was refined into the sharp, political ambition of the father, and finally polished into the courtly, magnificent influence of the son. They were a family of gamblers. They bet their lives on the mood of the monarch. They won fortunes, they lost heads, and they shaped a century. When you walk past the Tower of London today, or visit the ruins of Kenilworth, remember them not just as villains or favorites. Remember them as the mirror of the Tudor age itself, brilliant, cruel, artistic, ambitious, and ultimately fatal. The ledger is closed. The debt is paid.